How did the vast lands a woman inherited suddenly become her husband's to command? What ancient rules decreed that a sister might lose all to her younger brother simply for being born female? How was a life of devotion to God also a life of complete dispossession in 860 AD? Number 8. The iron grip of marriage and the husband's dominion. Imagine a world where your very identity, your legal standing, and your accumulated wealth could, with a simple exchange of vows, merge completely into another person's. For women in 860, a marriage was not just a union of hearts and families. It was a profound economic and legal transformation that often resulted in a significant loss of control over property. Across the burgeoning kingdoms of what would one day become France and Germany, and even into the scattered Anglo-Saxon realms, the principles guiding marital property were deeply rooted in a patriarchal understanding of society. A woman, upon marriage, frequently moved from the legal guardianship of her father or male relatives to that of her husband. This shift, while often framed as protection, was in practice a powerful mechanism for male control over assets. Consider the case of Isolde, a young woman living in the fertile heartland of the Carolingian Empire in the mid-9th century. Her father, a respected landowner with a modest estate, had carefully set aside a dowry for her marriage to a promising young man from a neighboring village. This dowry, comprised of a small parcel of arable land, a collection of valuable linen, and several silver coins, was intended to secure her standing within her new household and provide for her needs. Yet, the moment Isolde spoke her vows before the local priest and community, the legal reality of her world shifted dramatically. That parcel of land, once hers in a more direct sense, now fell under the complete administration of her husband, Leofric. He could decide whether to plant wheat or barley on it, whether to lease it to a tenant, or even in many cases to sell it without her direct consent. Her control, once tangible, became theoretical, existing only at the pleasure of her husband. This concept, while not yet formalized into the later legal doctrine of coverture as it would be centuries later, operated with similar practical effect. The husband was seen as the head of the household, the legal representative of the marital unit. His power was not merely social, but enshrined in customary law and evolving legal codes. Historians who have meticulously studied charters and wills from this period note a consistent pattern. Properties that entered a marriage through the wife often appeared in later documents solely in the husband's name or required his signature for any transaction. This was not always an act of malice. It was the prevailing legal framework, a reflection of a society that prioritized male authority and continuity of family lineage through the male line. The woman's property in essence became entangled with and often subsumed by her husband's. Moreover, the nature of the dowry itself varied. In some regions, particularly those influenced by Roman law traditions, a dowry might remain technically the wife's property, managed by the husband for the benefit of the family. However, even in such cases, her ability to directly manage, sell, or alienate these assets without her husband's approval was severely curtailed. The concept of separate property for married women was a rare and often tenuous exception, typically reserved for very specific circumstances or through explicit contractual arrangements that were far from common for the vast majority of women. For the average woman, the act of marriage meant a profound loss of economic independence. She could no longer freely engage in commerce with her inherited goods, nor could she, in many instances, bequeath them as she saw fit, without her husband's agreement. The very produce of the land she brought into the marriage, the wool from the sheep she owned, the timber from the woods that were technically part of her dowry, all became part of the family's communal property, managed and controlled by the husband. Consider the detailed legal codes of the time, such as those found in Frankish capitularies or the various Germanic laws. While they might mention a wife's rights to her dower, a portion of her husband's property set aside for her if she became a widow, They were often less explicit about her independent control over her own premarital assets. Once married, the husband's authority was seen as paramount, necessary for the efficient management of the household and the smooth functioning of society. A woman, by virtue of her marital status, was seen as being under her husband's legal hand, or mund. This meant he was her legal representative in most matters, including those involving property. If a dispute arose over land she had inherited, it was her husband who would stand in court, not her. If a sale of her property was needed for family reasons, it was his signature that held the primary legal weight. The impact on a woman's life was profound. Her ability to make independent financial decisions, to invest, to trade, or even to gift her own property was severely hampered, transforming her from an autonomous economic agent into a dependent, albeit often vital, part of her husband's household. This system was not without its internal logic, however flawed from a modern perspective. In a society where family units were the primary economic and social entities, the consolidation of property under one male head was believed to ensure stability and efficiency. The husband was responsible for the family's debts, for its protection, and for its economic well-being. Therefore, it was reason he must have control over its assets, regardless of their original source. Yet, this logic came at a considerable cost to women's individual agency. A woman like Isolde might have been a skilled manager of her father's household, before marriage familiar with agricultural cycles and market prices, but once married, her expertise was often relegated to the domestic sphere, while the broader economic decisions concerning her own inherited property were made by her husband. The wedding vows, therefore, were not merely a spiritual commitment, but a legal and economic contract that often bound a woman's property rights inextricably to her husband's will, stripping her of much of her economic autonomy and control in the process. Number 7. The unseen chains of guardianship and male supervision. Imagine living in a world where, even as an adult woman, your ability to make significant financial decisions, to buy or sell property, or to enter into contracts was not entirely your own. For many women in 860, and irrespective of their marital status, the concept of male guardianship cast a long shadow over their property rights. This wasn't always about malicious intent. It was often rooted in deeply ingrained social norms and legal customs that viewed women as requiring male protection and supervision in matters of law and finance. Whether unmarried, widowed, or even in some nuanced interpretations of married status, a woman often found herself under the legal mund or tutelage of a male relative, be it her father, brother, uncle, or even her eldest son if she was widowed. Consider the plight of Theodora, a spirited young woman from a noble Bavarian family. Her parents had passed away when she was young, leaving her a substantial inheritance of vineyards and a small dwelling. By the customs of the time, Theodora, though an adult of 25 years, was deemed to require the guardianship of her uncle, a distant but influential relative. Her uncle, a man of stern countenance and considerable ambition, took control of her inherited lands, while he was legally obligated to manage them for her benefit and provide her with an income. The power dynamic was clear. He dictated which crops were planted, negotiated the sale of her wine, and handled all transactions concerning her property. Theodora herself could not, for instance, decide to sell a portion of her vineyard to raise funds for a charitable endeavor, or to invest in a new venture, no matter how sound the idea. Any such action would require her uncle's explicit approval and signature, effectively rendering her a minor in financial matters. This system of guardianship was prevalent across various Germanic legal traditions that heavily influenced early medieval Europe. The principle was that women, being perceived as weaker or less suited to the rigors of legal and financial dealings, needed a male protector. This protector was not just a nominal figure. He possessed significant legal authority over the woman's property. He could represent her in court, make decisions regarding the management and even disposition of her assets, and ensure her financial security, all without her direct consent being a primary requirement. While some progressive legal thinkers or local customs might have allowed for a woman to gain a measure of autonomy through legal emancipation or by demonstrating exceptional competence, these were often rare exceptions rather than the norm. Prevailing view was that a woman's best interests were served by having a man manage her affairs. Even for widows, who often gained more legal standing than married women, this guardianship could still manifest. While a widow might technically regain control over her dowry and dower lands, if she was deemed too young, inexperienced, or vulnerable, her husband's male relatives, or even the king's local representative, might be appointed as her guardian. Her ability to manage her property freely, especially large estates, could still be constrained. For instance, a widow named Brunhilde, left with a substantial estate in Saxony after her husband's death, found herself subjected to the oversight of her late husband's brothers. They argued that her estate needed proper male management and that she lacked the experience to fend off predatory neighbors. While Brunhilde protested, the social and legal pressure to accept their protection was immense, and she effectively lost day-to-day control over her lands despite their legal ownership technically being hers. Scholars examining the societal structures of the 9th century often highlight how deeply embedded these notions of male authority were. From the moment a girl was born, her path was largely defined by her relationship to men: father, brother, husband, guardian. These relationships were not just familial bonds, but legal frameworks that determined her access to and control over resources. The very idea of an adult woman independently managing a large fortune, negotiating complex legal contracts, or representing herself in property disputes was often alien to the prevailing legal and social norms. Records from this period, such as legal formularies and accounts of land transactions, consistently show the involvement of male guardians or representatives whenever a woman's property was concerned. This was not a system designed to intentionally dispossess women of their wealth in every instance, but its practical effect was often exactly that. By ceding management and decision-making power to male relatives, women effectively lost control, even if they retained nominal ownership. Unseen chains of guardianship ensured that even property, nominally hers, remained under the powerful hand of a male supervisor, limiting her agency and economic freedom in profound ways. Number 6. The dire consequences of debt and dispossession. Imagine a woman who diligently worked her land, managed her household, and saved her meager earnings, only to see everything she had built or inherited vanish due to the poor decisions or overwhelming financial burdens of a male relative. In the landscape of 860, a debt was a brutal master, and its long, cold reach often extended to strip women of their property rights, even if the debt itself was not of their making. The legal and social structures of the time often tied a woman's economic fate inextricably to her male relatives, particularly her husband or father. When these men fell into significant debt, whether through failed harvests, excessive gambling, costly legal disputes, or political missteps, the family's assets, including those technically belonging to the women, were frequently on the chopping block. Consider the story of Agnes, a farmer's daughter from the Rhineland. Agnes had inherited a small but fertile plot of land from her mother, a rare instance where property had passed directly through the female line. She tended her vegetables, kept a few chickens, and her independence was built on that small piece of earth. Her father, however, was a man of ambition but poor judgment. He borrowed heavily from a powerful local magnate to expand his own holdings, hoping for a bountiful harvest that never came. When the debts mounted and default loomed, the magnate, a shrewd operator, sought repayment. The law of the time, often favoring the creditor and upholding the patriarchal family structure, allowed for the seizure of family assets to satisfy debts. While Agnes's plot was legally hers, it was considered part of the broader family estate under her father's dominion. The magnate's men arrived, and her small cherished piece of land, along with her father's larger fields, was confiscated to settle the father's ruinous debt. Agnes, though entirely innocent of the financial misdealings, found herself dispossessed, her property lost, and her independence shattered. This scenario was not uncommon. Concept of joint marital property, where the husband was the primary manager and legal representative, meant that his debts often became the family's debts. If a husband, through ill-advised ventures or sheer misfortune, accumulated significant liabilities, creditors would look to the family's assets for repayment. This included lands, livestock, and goods that the wife might have brought into the marriage's dowry, or that she had inherited. While some dowry agreements might have attempted to protect a wife's assets from her husband's personal debts, these protections were often weak and difficult to enforce in a legal system that heavily favored male authority and creditor rights. The line between a husband's individual assets and his wife's became blurred, especially when the husband had the legal right to manage and dispose of all marital property. Moreover, the feudal and quasi-feudal structures of the time meant that land was not just an economic asset but a source of power and obligation. If a male landholder failed in his obligations to his lord, or if he committed a crime that resulted in forfeiture, all property associated with him, including that nominally belonging to his wife or female relatives, could be seized. Imagine Eudoxia, a high-born woman whose husband, a count, fell out of favor with the emperor. Accused of treason, his lands were stripped away. Not just his personal holdings, but also the rich estates that Eudoxia had brought into the marriage from her own distinguished family. In the eyes of the law and the emperor, the husband's actions implicated the entire marital property, leaving Eudoxia, though innocent, utterly destitute and dependent. Historical records, while not always detailing individual cases with modern precision, nonetheless contain ample evidence of property transfers under duress to satisfy debts or fines. Charters detailing land sales and transfers often make no distinction between the husband's and wife's contribution when liquidating assets to cover obligations. The underlying assumption was that the male head of household bore the ultimate financial responsibility, and his actions, for better or worse, determined the fate of the family's collective wealth. This meant that a woman's inherent economic vulnerability was heightened. Her property could be lost not because of her own poor stewardship or misdeeds, but because of the financial misfortunes or misconduct of the men who legally controlled her life. The system, designed to consolidate power and responsibility in the male line, often left women exposed to severe economic risks, stripping them of their property through the relentless burden of others' debts. Number 5. The sacred surrender of religious life. Imagine making a solemn vow to dedicate your life to God, a profound spiritual commitment, only to discover that this sacred act also entails a complete and irreversible surrender of all your worldly possessions. For many women in 860 AD, who chose the path of the convent, this was an unwritten yet absolute rule. The act of entering a religious order was not merely a personal spiritual journey. It was also a significant legal and economic event that often resulted in the permanent transfer of their property to the institution they joined. In a world where family wealth and land were central to social standing and survival, this decision, while often driven by deep faith, simultaneously stripped women of their individual property rights. Consider the story of Sister Hildegard, a young woman of noble birth from the region of Franconia. Her family, devout and influential, had initially intended for her to make a politically advantageous marriage. However, Hildegard felt a powerful calling to the cloistered life. After much deliberation and familial negotiation, she was permitted to enter a prominent Benedictine convent. Terms of her entry, common for women of her status, were clear. Her family provided a substantial endowment or dowry to the convent, which was meant to secure her place and contribute to the upkeep of the religious community. Simultaneously, any personal property Hildegard possessed, perhaps a small inheritance of jewelry, a parcel of land, or even a book of psalms she treasured, was formally transferred to the convent's ownership. From that moment on, she owned nothing. Her identity became subsumed by her new spiritual family, and her former individual property became part of the convent's collective wealth. This practice was deeply embedded in the monastic tradition of the time. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were not abstract concepts. They had tangible legal and economic implications. The vow of poverty, in particular, mandated that an individual relinquish all personal possessions. This was seen as a virtuous act, a complete detachment from the material world in pursuit of spiritual purity. For women, this meant that any inherited lands, gold, or even the clothes on their back, if they had entered the convent with them, ceased to be theirs. Convent, as a legal entity, absorbed these assets, using them for its own sustenance, charitable work, or the construction and maintenance of its buildings. Historians examining conventual charters and donation records from the 9th century consistently find instances where women, upon their profession, formally alienated their property to their respective monasteries. This wasn't always a negative outcome for the women themselves, at least from their perspective. For some, entering a convent offered an alternative to forced marriage, a path to education, or a life of intellectual and spiritual pursuit that was otherwise unavailable. However, the economic reality was undeniable. It meant the complete cessation of individual property rights. A woman who entered a convent could not later decide to sell a piece of land she once owned, nor could she bequeath it to a favorite niece. Her economic agency, so constrained in secular life, was utterly extinguished, in the religious sphere replaced by a communal dependency on the institution. Even if her family had given her a large endowment upon entry, that endowment became the convent's, not hers to manage or control. Consider the role of convents as significant landowners in the early medieval period. They accumulated vast estates, not only through the piety of patrons, but also through the individual wealth brought in by women who joined their ranks. These properties were then managed by the abbess or other male administrators associated with the convent, further consolidating control over wealth in the hands of the institution rather than the individual women who had originally contributed it. The journey of a woman like Hildegard, from possessing personal property to becoming a part of a collective religious body with no individual possessions, illustrates a fundamental way women lost property rights. It was a loss chosen, yes, but a complete loss, nonetheless. A transaction where spiritual gain was explicitly balanced against the absolute surrender of worldly possessions, leaving women entirely reliant on the communal resources of their chosen sacred home. Number 4. The exclusionary rules of inheritance and primogeniture's shadow. Imagine a family where, generation after generation, the wealth, the land, and the very legacy of the lineage flow exclusively through the male line, bypassing daughters, sisters, and even mothers in favor of the nearest male relative. For women in 860, the laws and customs governing inheritance were often rigged against them, ensuring that significant property, especially landed estates, rarely remained in their direct control beyond a single lifetime, if it reached them at all. The widespread preference for male heirs, often termed primogeniture, was a powerful mechanism that stripped women of their potential inheritance, reinforcing patriarchal control over land and power. Consider the case of Ingrid, a woman born into a prominent Frankish noble family. Her father, a baron, possessed extensive lands and considerable wealth. Ingrid was his eldest child, intelligent and capable, but she had 2 younger brothers. Under the prevailing Salic law, a legal code influential in the Carolingian Empire, women were explicitly excluded from inheriting certain types of landed property, particularly the Salic land, which comprised the core of the family's estate. While the precise application of Salic law varied and evolved, its underlying principle of male preference in inheritance was deeply ingrained. So, upon her father's death, Ingrid, despite her seniority and competence, inherited only a modest sum of money, and perhaps some movable goods as her portion. The vast, valuable family estates, the castles, the forests, and the villages tied to them, all passed directly to her younger brothers. Personal economic power was thus significantly curtailed, a stark contrast to the vast wealth and influence her male siblings instantly commanded. This system of male preference was not unique to the Franks. Across Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and other Germanic-influenced regions, while a daughter might receive a dowry upon marriage, and a widow might be granted a dower or jointure for her lifetime, the outright inheritance of substantial estates by women was often limited. The primary goal of inheritance law was to keep the family lands intact, to ensure the continuity of the male lineage, and to preserve the power and status associated with that line. Women were seen as transient members of a family, moving from their birth family to their husband's family upon marriage. Their inheritance, therefore, was often less about independent ownership and more about providing a suitable dowry to secure a good marriage or a temporary maintenance as a widow. Scholars studying medieval wills and charters frequently point to the consistent pattern of property, especially major estates passing from father to son, or lacking a son, to a brother or male cousin. While a woman might inherit movable goods, household items, or even small parcels of land in some specific instances, these were rarely the core wealth-generating assets that formed the bedrock of family power. Even when no male heirs were immediately available, the property might be held in trust or managed by male relatives until a suitable male successor could be found or born, rather than passing outright to a female. Imagine the frustration of a woman like Bertha, who saw her family's ancestral lands pass to a distant male cousin simply because her father had no sons, despite Bertha being a capable and mature woman, fully capable of managing the estate herself. The law and custom deemed otherwise, prebenditizing the male lineage above all else. This profound bias in inheritance laws had far-reaching consequences for women's economic independence. It prevented them from accumulating significant personal wealth in the form of land, which was the primary source of power and status in the agrarian societies of the 9th century. It forced them into greater reliance on their fathers, brothers, and husbands for economic security. The dower, the portion of her husband's property set aside for her use during widowhood, was generally for her lifetime only, and usually reverted to her husband's family upon her death. This meant that while she might have temporary use of land, she did not truly own it in a way that allowed her to pass it on to her own chosen heirs, thus severing the potential for a direct female line of inheritance for substantial property. The shadow of primogeniture and male preference thus ensured that for the vast majority of women, large-scale inherited wealth was a dream largely unattainable, a fundamental pillar of society that consistently excluded them from direct and lasting control over valuable property. Number 3. The silent voices and absent signatures in legal proceedings. Imagine trying to defend your rights, sell your property, or make a crucial financial agreement, but the law simply would not recognize your voice. For women in 860, at a profound barrier to property rights was their often limited legal standing. In many parts of early medieval Europe, women were frequently unable to represent themselves in courts of law, negotiate contracts independently, or legally enforce their own property claims without the explicit presence or authority of a male guardian or husband. This systemic lack of direct legal agency meant that even where women nominally possessed property, their ability to control or protect it was severely curtailed. Consider the predicament of Gisela, a skilled textile merchant in a bustling market town in Lotharingia. Gisela had built her business through hard work and shrewd dealings, accumulating a small warehouse and a sum of silver. When a dishonest supplier failed to deliver a large order of wool, costing Gisela a significant amount of money, she sought recourse through the local court. However, upon arrival, she was informed that she could not directly present her case. She required a mund or male legal guardian to speak on her behalf. Her elderly father, frail and unfamiliar with the nuances of commerce, had to stand before the judge and articulate her claims. The intricacies of the trade dispute, the specific agreements, and the subtle deceptions were all filtered through her father's understanding, weakening her case and ultimately leading to a less favorable outcome than she might have achieved had she been allowed to speak for herself. This requirement for a male representative was not arbitrary. It was deeply ingrained in the legal customs of many Germanic tribes and persisted in the emerging legal systems of the Carolingian Empire. Women were often deemed to be legally minor or under protection, regardless of their age or intellectual capacity. This meant that any legal transaction concerning their property, such as selling a piece of land, witnessing a deed, or entering into a formal agreement, often required the active participation and signature of a husband, father, brother, or appointed male guardian. Without this male consent or presence, the legal validity of the transaction could be challenged, leaving the woman's property vulnerable. Even in cases where a woman might technically own property, such as her dower lands as a widow, her ability to fully exercise her rights was often contingent on male approval or oversight. If a neighboring lord encroached upon her dower land, a widow might find it difficult to initiate a legal challenge without the backing of her husband's family or her own male kin. The concept of a woman standing alone in a formal court, presenting her own evidence, cross-examining witnesses, or challenging male authority figures was largely an anomaly and often considered scandalous or improper. Accounts from legal proceedings of the era where they exist overwhelmingly feature men as the primary actors and decision-makers, with women's involvement being indirect through male proxies. Moreover, the process of documenting property transfers often required formal oaths and signatures. While women's names might appear on charters as grantors or recipients, it was almost always alongside or underneath the signature or mark of their male representative, emphasizing the subordinate nature of their legal standing. Scholars analyzing medieval charters note the consistent pattern of male presence in transactions involving women's property. This was not merely a social courtesy, it was a legal necessity. If a woman had to sell a piece of land she inherited to survive a famine, the deed of sale would likely require her husband's or guardian's consent and signature to be considered legitimate and enforceable. Without it, the buyer might face legal challenges later. This pervasive lack of direct legal standing effectively disarmed women in the economic arena. It made them reliant on men to articulate their claims, protect their interests, and validate their transactions. Even if a woman had a strong grasp of her economic situation, the legal system itself often prevented her from acting independently to safeguard her property rights. Her voice, while powerful within the domestic sphere, often became silent or indirect in the public legal domain, making it incredibly challenging to defend, manage, or expand her property without the constant mediation and approval of men. Number 2. The political whirlwind and the sweeping hand of forfeiture. Imagine the sudden brutal shift in your world when the political winds change, when your husband or father falls from favor with the king, or when war sweeps across the land. For women in 860 AD, property rights were often tenuous threads, easily severed by the sweeping hand of political upheaval and the harsh penalties of forfeiture. In a system where land was synonymous with power and loyalty, the fortunes of powerful men directly dictated the economic security of their wives and daughters. When a lord was deemed disloyal, defeated in battle, or condemned for treason, his entire estate, often including property nominally belonging to his wife or inherited by his female kin, could be confiscated by the crown or granted to a new favored vassal. Consider the tragic fate of Liutgard, a woman of considerable standing whose husband, a prominent count in the Frankish kingdom, was caught in rebellion against the emperor. Liutgard herself had inherited a significant portion of her wealth, including a fortified manor and several lucrative farms, from her own noble family. She had brought this property into her marriage, strengthening her husband's position. However, when the rebellion failed and her husband was captured and condemned, the emperor, swift and decisive, ordered the forfeiture of all his lands and assets. The decrees made no distinction between the count's personal property and the lands Lutgard had inherited. In the eyes of the emperor's law, the entire estate was considered part of the count's holdings, or at least inextricably linked to his treason. Liutgard, despite her innocence in the political machinations, found herself stripped of everything, her manor seized, her tenants now owing allegiance to a new lord, and she herself reduced to destitute relatives. This was a recurring pattern in the tumultuous early medieval period. Loyalty was paramount, and the crown or a victorious lord held immense power to punish disloyalty through the confiscation of property. Concept of individual property rights for women, separate from their male family head, was often secondary to the imperative of maintaining political order and rewarding loyalty. Even if a dowry had been meticulously documented as belonging to the wife, the pragmatic realities of political power often overrode such legal niceties in times of upheaval. A victorious lord would simply seize the entire estate, and challenging such an act was incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for a dispossessed woman without powerful male backing. Wars and invasions also played a devastating role. When Viking raids swept through coastal regions, or when internal feuds between powerful lords escalated into open conflict, land was ravaged, homes burned, and property seized. While these losses affected everyone, women were often particularly vulnerable. Their inability to bear arms, their often restricted mobility, and their legal dependence on men meant they were less able to defend their property or flee with their assets. A woman like Ulfgifu, whose small farm in Anglo-Saxon England was razed during a Viking incursion, lost not only her home and livelihood, but also any tangible claim to the land itself, as the original deeds were destroyed, and the authority to whom she might appeal had vanished. Historical records, such as chronicles and royal decrees, often detail large-scale confiscations of land from rebellious or defeated nobles. These accounts rarely specify the impact on the wives or female relatives, but the implication is clear. The property was lost to the family, and therefore to the women within it. Power of the state or the dominant feudal lord superseded individual claims, especially those of women who had limited recourse in the face of overwhelming political authority. The concept of attainder, while formalizing centuries later, had its roots in this period, where a man's crimes or disloyalty could effectively taint his entire lineage and property, leading to the forfeiture of everything. Thus, a woman's economic fate was often inextricably linked to the political allegiances and actions of the men in her life, making her property rights highly susceptible to the unpredictable and often brutal forces of political power and conflict, leading to sudden and devastating dispossession. Number 1. The widow's precarious freedom and the pressure to remarry. Imagine regaining a semblance of control over your property, only to find yourself immediately under immense pressure to relinquish it once more. For women in 860, at widowhood, often presented a complex paradox. A moment of newfound legal autonomy, swiftly followed by social and familial pressures, that could lead to another significant loss of property rights through forced remarriage. While a widow generally enjoyed more legal standing than a married woman, including the right to manage her dower lands and sometimes her original dowry, this freedom was often tenuous and conditional, constantly threatened by the prevailing social emphasis on male headship and family continuity. Consider the journey of Adelheid, a respected matron from the kingdom of West Francia. Upon the sudden death of her husband, a knight Adelheid found herself in charge of his substantial estate. As was customary, she was granted her dower, a portion of the family lands meant to sustain her during her widowhood, and she also regained direct control over the property she had brought into the marriage as her dowry. For a brief period, Adelheid experienced an unprecedented level of economic independence. She oversaw the harvests, managed the servants, and made decisions about the sale of produce. Her legal standing, unconstrained by a husband's authority, allowed her to directly represent her interests. However, This freedom was often short-lived and fraught with challenges. Powerful families, including her late husband's relatives, were deeply concerned about the continuity of the male lineage and the preservation of their lands. They feared that Adelheid, if left to her own devices, might remarry someone outside the family, potentially diverting the estate or its future produce to another lineage. They also worried about her ability to manage such a large estate effectively in a turbulent era, perceiving her as vulnerable. Intense pressure mounted for her to remarry, often to a male relative of her deceased husband, such as a younger brother or a cousin. While Adelheid initially resisted the combined weight of social expectation, familial demands, and sometimes even veiled threats from powerful lords, who also wanted to secure the alliance through marriage, became overwhelming. Eventually, Adelheid was persuaded or compelled to marry her late husband's younger brother, a man she barely knew. The moment the marriage vows were exchanged, her newfound autonomy evaporated. Her dower lands, which had been hers to manage, once again fell under the direct control of a husband. Her own dowry, which she had regained a measure of control over, also became subject to her new husband's management, mirroring the situation of her first marriage. Her property rights, so briefly reclaimed, were once more subsumed into a marital unit under male headship. Pressure to remarry for widows, especially those with significant property or high status, was immense. Kings and lords often saw widows as valuable assets to be used for political alliances or to consolidate power, marrying them off to loyal vassals or relatives. Local customs often stipulated that a widow could only retain her dower so long as she remained chaste or unmarried. If she remarried, her dower would typically revert to her late husband's heirs, unless explicit provisions were made for it to pass to her new husband. This served as a powerful disincentive for independent decision-making and a strong push towards remarriage within the family's preferred circle. Historians, studying the practices of the time, often note that while specific legal codes might grant widows significant rights, the social and political realities frequently undermined them. Charters and legal records sometimes show widows granting away land to their late husband's family or remarrying soon after their husband's death, suggesting the strong pressures they faced. For a woman, widowhood offered a glimpse of economic independence, a brief opportunity to control her own assets. Yet, this window was often narrow, and the prevailing societal forces, driven by the male-dominated desire to preserve lineage, consolidate power, and manage land efficiently, conspired to push her back into a state of legal dependence, leading to another often swift loss of her property rights through a new marital union